Hi guys, so we're going to try to finish up this chapter today, and we should be on page 223 or thereabouts. And we've been talking about England and France, and how since 1066 William the Conqueror was a French nobleman who then became King of France. So now England owns part of France, but are also vassals to the French king, and it's a huge mess. And so naturally, this is going to lead to war. And it's called the Hundred Years' War because it lasted about 113 years. 100 Years' War, about 1337 to 1453, and you can see here the map of kind of how things changed. Green would be English land, and you can see how it shifted back and forth and back and forth. But at the end of the Hundred Years' War, France owns France, and England does not. This war contributed to the decline of feudalism in both England and France, made the noblemen less powerful and the kings much more powerful. You'll see in any time of crisis, the leadership often gets stronger. In a national emergency, US presidents often get their way. And there's very little arguing about that. For instance, in the Greatest Way, even though some of the things he did were unconstitutional and were eventually struck down by the Supreme Court. But, it's a national emergency, just let him do his thing. Abraham Lincoln removed the right of habeas corpus in Maryland, and not a lot of people complained. Or if they did, they got chucked in jail. But, it's a national emergency. Another reason feudalism declined is a bunch of the noblemen get killed in this war. So the knights are the noblemen are the knights. The main fighting force of both England and France are going to be the noblemen. They're the only ones who can afford war horses and really heavy armor. And so they are the fighting force of both lands. And after years and years, hundreds of years of fighting, whole noble families get wiped out, where dad dies and every son dies without an heir. Sometimes this takes multiple generations as the fighting men of the family just die out. And when they die out, the king gets their land. And the king becomes much, much more powerful because of this. It also made people think nationally. If you're not thinking regionally, this nobleman against this nobleman, you're thinking nationally, England versus France. And now both sides have really a nation to consider. We're at war with another nation. We're not at war with another, English-speaking nobleman. We're at war with the French, and they're different from us. So we love us and hate you, and made a very clear us versus them that was not there during feudalism in the Middle Ages. Where your worst enemies probably speak the same language as you and only live a few miles away. What are some of the immediate causes of the war? Obviously, two strong nations very close to one another are going to have some conflicts. And then the kings of England also being noblemen serving under the king of France, that's going to cause a lot of weird tension. Ever since William the Conqueror, there has been tension between England and France. Eventually, France started to invade what is called Flanders. That's an area that would be Belgium and the Netherlands today. Very rich trading community there. They were some of the first people to trade after the Middle Ages, and France invaded it, and England got mad because England traded with them a lot. Remember, for 300 years, there was a French king from the line of the Capetians, and the last Capetian monarch died without an heir. So now there's a scramble to see who's going to be the next king of France. Edward III, King of England, says, I want to be King of France too, because my mom was the sister of the last three French kings. So a French king died without an heir, they made his brother king. He died without an heir, they made his brother king. Now they're all out of brothers, but there is a nephew. And saying, I'm the nephew of three French kings, that is a very strong claim to the throne. The thing is, there's not a single French nobleman who wants the English king to also be the French king. That would be just absolutely terrible for France. Like I said, that would basically make us, lose the entire country without a fight. We don't want that. So the French noblemen instead vote among themselves, and they pick Philip the Sixth Valois. That's his last name. So I guess his name would have been Philip Valois. And when he became king, he was the sixth king named Philip, so they call him Philip the Sixth. And now he is the new French king. And of course, Edward III can't just leave well enough alone. He's going to fight for the throne of France. In the beginning of the Hundred Years' War, the English did very, very well, and there were three notable, huge, lopsided victories that the English had over the French at the Battle of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. And maybe you've heard of some of these. These are incredible battles that turn the tide of history and the makeup of armies. Let me read to you something about the Battle of Crécy. The Battle of Crécy resulted in victory for the English in the first decade of the Hundred Years' War against the French. It shocked European leaders because a small but disciplined English force fighting on foot had overwhelmed the finest cavalry in Europe. Edward III of England, having landed some 4,000 men-at-arms and 10,000 longbowmen on the Cotentin Peninsula in mid-July 1346, had ravaged Lower Normandy west of the Seine and gone as far south as Poissy, just outside of Paris, when Philip VI of France, uncertain of the direction that Edward meant to take, advanced against him with some 12,000 men-at-arms and numerous other troops. Edward then turned sharply northeastward, crossing the Seine at Poissy and the Somme downstream from Abbeville, to take up a defensive position at Crécy. There he posted dismounted men-at-arms in the center, with cavalry to their right under his son Edward the Black Prince, and to their left under the Earls of Arundel and Northampton, and with archers in both wings. Italian crossbowmen in Philip's service began the assault in the English position, but they were routed by the archers and fell back into the path of the French cavalry's first charge. See, the crossbowmen had a much shorter range than the English longbowmen, and they were like completely defeated before they got off more than one or two shots. Also, it had rained earlier, and the crossbow bowstrings were wet and almost completely useless. Their range, their power was effectively cut in half, which meant they had almost no range, and if they did hit anything, it's probably not going to be a serious wound. Whereas the British had been much more careful and had packed away their bowstrings in the rain in oiled leather pouches, which are completely waterproof. So the English are at full strength, and these crossbowmen are just awful. So the crossbowmen get shot to pieces, and they run away in the middle of the battlefield. Here come the French cavalry. And remember, cavalry means noblemen. Thousands of noblemen come charging, and that is the strength of the cavalry charge. There's just so many of them. They're so heavy. They're going so fast. Now they have to slow down. They're either running over these Genoese crossbowmen, or they're slowing down to pick their way through them, and that charge is not doing very well. More and more French cavalry came up behind that first charge and were pushing them forward, so there's this big mess in the rear. They made further thoughtless charges right at the English center, but while the latter stood firm, the archers wheeled forward, and the successive detachments of horsemen were mown down by arrows from both sides. So the French are attacking straight down the middle, the English enveloped with longbowmen shooting on both sides. And maybe you've heard of the strength of English longbowmen. It's absolutely incredible. There's some pictures for you about what happens in each one of these battles, English longbowmen against French knights. Those few who managed to reach the English lines died in fierce fighting. Some 15 or 16 further attacks continued throughout the night, each one mown down by English archers. By the end of the day, Philip's brother, Charles II of Alençon, and his allies, King John of Bohemia and Louis II, Count of Flanders, as well as 1,500 other knights and esquires were dead. Philip himself escaped with a wound from the disaster. Edward went on northward to besiege Calais. So pretty amazing how these peasant longbowmen are decimating the French noblemen. And they're doing an incredible job against overwhelming numbers. They're winning in an absolute victory. The son there, the son of the king, Edward the Black Prince, got that name for his black armor. He got really famous at the Battle of Crécy, and then when he became king, about a decade later, he led the charge at the Battle of Poitiers. Let me read to you a little bit about Edward the Black Prince. He was the son and heir apparent of Edward III of England, one of the outstanding commanders during the Hundred Years' War, winning the major victory at the Battle of Poitiers. A little bit more here. His first campaign, he served under his father at the Battle of Crécy. He won his spurs there, which means that he earned the title of knight. He's not just a prince now, he's a knight. And he also earned the right to wear his famous ostrich feather plumes in his helmet. That's pretty cool. And gave himself the titles Humo Ikidina, which means courage I serve, which is pretty cool. One of the original Knights of the Garter. He won his most famous victory over the French at Poitiers, September 19, 1356. At the Battle of Poitiers, the Black Prince of England captures, I guess King of England now, captures the French King John II, brings him to the Tower of London, and sells him back to France for a ransom of 3 million gold coins. Which is pretty awesome. The king of the French was captured by the English king. Wow, pretty sweet. These battles are where we get the term infantry. So cavalry comes from the Latin word, which means horseman, pretty obvious. Infantry comes from the French word that means infant, like literally infant, like child. And that's how these French noblemen looked at the peasants who made up the bulk of their army. The French knights could take on hundreds of peasants all by themselves, usually. So usually when you're going into battle, your armor is nearly impenetrable, and a handful of knights can go up against peasants with, leather armor or just cloth armor, and you can go up 10 to 1 and just absolutely mow them down. You have the advantage of your war horse, of a huge long spear, of a great big sword, and they can be beating on you all day long, and you're just getting a few bruises here and there. It is very difficult to take down a knight. Well, by the Hundred Years' War, the longbow, the English had developed a 6-foot tall bow that could, at the proper angle and range, if they were in close enough range, it could punch through that armor. And probably, even more importantly, it could go through the horse. It could wound the horse even through its armor. And then a heavily armored knight away from his horse is not as big of a threat, and you can actually a big method of fighting those knights would be just to tackle them and have a couple of people hold them down, and everyone else tries finding places to stab them, which is kind of crazy, but there you go. So by the end of the Battle of Agincourt, which basically had the exact same thing happen, where just a couple thousand English longbowmen decimate all the French nobles, you have a lot greater respect for the infants of the field, the infantry. And on page 223, your book says that a skilled longbowman could shoot an arrow about 270 yards. That's almost 3 football fields. They would practice for several hours a day. Every peasant in England would practice archery for several hours a day. In fact, when golf was first brought down from Scotland, where it was invented, the King of England banned golf because he thought that the people would play golf too much and not have time to practice their archery. So pretty cool. Well, eventually, as the war goes on for hundreds of years, there's not a major battle every single year. Some years there isn't even any fighting at all. But there's lots of fighting over decades and decades and generations. Imagine if World War I hadn't stopped yet. World War I was about 100 years ago. Imagine if it was still going on today. That would be kind of crazy, huh? Both sides are losing a lot of soldiers and a lot of people, a lot of money, and that's called attrition, where both sides are just grinding themselves down. So it doesn't really matter if you win a lot of battles, you're also losing a lot of battles, and the battles that you're winning, you're still losing men and money and supplies on. You can't keep this going on forever. So both sides are really tired of the war after about 100 years. Joan of Arc was this young lady, older teenager from the town of Metz, which is why she's sometimes called Jeanne de Metz, but we also call her Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. And she hears voices in her head that tell her to go fight the English, and she thinks that they're from God, or an angel at least. And apparently everyone else does too, because she gains a small following and becomes basically a general in the war, completely unofficial. There's no way any French nobleman would follow a girl or a woman of any kind. Doesn't matter what her qualifications are. But there's plenty of peasants who say only God can help us win this war, because the English have been doing very well for most of the war. So plenty of peasants are flocking to her, and she is getting an army of her own. Eventually, she gets to the French prince called the Dauphin, who is actually a very young man. And she convinces the Dauphin to make her the official leader of the French army, and he does. says, okay, well, you have God's blessing, I guess, because you hear voices in your head. And she would go out and fight, and she would fight from the front lines, and she would make speeches, and it would be epic, and people would listen to her, and they would fight for her. She got really famous for breaking the siege at Orleans. Maybe you've heard of New Orleans. This is Old Orleans, Orleans, a big city. I think it was about as big as Paris at the time, maybe even a little bigger at Paris. The English had been besieging it for a while, and when she came with her reserve army, she was able to break the siege. A lot of the French were very demoralized for a very long time, and she brought that morale back, and they just started winning battle after battle after battle after battle, and eventually they do manage to kick the English out. Uh, there you go. Not until, though, she was captured, and the English burn her at the stake as a heretic. You see, you're not supposed to kill enemy soldiers that you capture, especially leaders. Officers of any kind are to be treated as royalty, as nobility, and to be treated as honored guests while they are your prisoners. Which is why when you capture the King of France, you don't throw him in a dungeon. You have him in a beautiful apartment in the Tower of London, which is a prison, but it's a prison for royalty, right? Uh, However, this is a girl, and she's won way too many battles, and she's not a noble lady. She's just a peasant girl. So they say, we can kill her, but we want to follow the rules of chivalry and everything. We need an excuse to kill her. So they burned her as a heretic because she wore pants on her war horse. And if she wears pants, she must be lesbian. So therefore, she's a heretic. Burn her at the stake. And there you go. They killed her. Not too long after her death, the French had her sainted. So apparently, if a Catholic priest burns you as a heretic, you get sent straight to hell. Do not pass go, do not pass, collect $200. If the Pope saints you, you go directly to heaven. So here we have a contradiction. Where's Joan of Arc right now? Depends on who you ask, French or the British. Results of the Hundred Years' War, England lost. England was kicked out of France and no longer has any holdings in the mainland of Europe. But losing was good for England because it ignored France after that and then started thinking globally. And of course, then it went to build an empire, the biggest land empire the world has ever seen. And England went on to own about a fifth of the world's land mass. So I'd trade France for a fifth of the globe any day. But English soldiers came home after the Hundred Years' War to find a new civil war at home called the War of the Roses. Lancaster versus York, trying to decide who's going to be king. One of them had the emblem of a red rose. The other has the emblem of a white rose. And let me read you something from our book. Jealousy, anger, and political maneuvering led to armed conflict between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. The first battle, St. Albans, was fought in July 1455. In 1460, Richard of York openly claimed the English throne, and the conflict intensified. He was later killed in battle that same year. The Yorkists won the bloody Battle of Towton in 1461, and Edward IV became England's first Yorkist king. 4 years later, Henry VI of Lancaster was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, while the conflict continued. It was not until Edward IV won the Battle of Tewkesbury that the Yorkists seemed to have solidified their hold on the throne. Nevertheless, the dynasty soon collapsed. In 1483, 12-year-old Edward V was removed from power by his uncle Richard, and both 12-year-old Edward and his younger brother were imprisoned at the Tower of London, where they were subsequently murdered, or at least no one ever heard from them again. Their uncle proclaimed himself Richard III. However, Richard was never popular. Therefore, when Henry Tudor, distant relative of the House of Lancaster, landed in Wales in 1485, many of Richard's supporters deserted him. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III was killed and Henry became the victor, calling himself Henry Tudor. Henry had no legal right to the English throne. However, when he presented himself to Parliament after his victory, he was crowned King Henry VII. To prevent future conflict, he married Elizabeth of York, thus uniting and reconciling the House of York and Lancaster. So Richard III is a subject of one of Shakespeare's best plays called Richard III, in which he is portrayed as an evil hunchback. And it is true, he did have major scoliosis. And, well, he murdered a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old to gain the throne, so pretty evil. Just a handful of years ago, they found two bodies of young teenage boys buried under a stone staircase in a castle that they were renovating. They're like, oh, We found the princes. Like literally, when Shakespeare wrote about it a couple hundred years later, several hundred years later, Shakespeare writes about Richard III, and no one knew what happened to the princes, just that they disappeared, and everyone assumes that they're dead in a ditch somewhere. And then in the early 2000s, I believe, we found the two bodies. Then, when I believe this was when I was in college, so late 2000s, early 2010, somewhere around there, they were digging up land in England to build a new parking lot, and they found a body with a bunch of gold jewelry and stuff. And I'm like, oh, interesting. Very old, lots of gold in it. Pretty cool. Let's do some DNA tests. Well, they found that that body was related, that skeleton was related to Queen Elizabeth. I'm like, oh, it's a royal person. And they checked the spine, and the spine had some major scoliosis. And it was actually this field that they were building the new parking lot in. I believe it was once part of a castle courtyard that was owned by Richard III. So we think we found Richard III's bones too. So that's pretty cool. So here's Henry VII calling himself Tudor, starts a new royal dynasty, and of course his son is the famous Henry VIII, and then his children, Bloody Mary and Queen Elizabeth, become very, very famous. In France, what's happening there because of the sport? The French kings increased their power over the nobility, partially because all the noblemen are dead in all these battles, and partially because of this emergency. They claim an emergency tax called a taille, something like that. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it, but they are levying this tax without consent of the Estates General, saying we need this tax to pay the war, so you got to pay it. So the king can do whatever he wants now without even the noblemen's consent, much less the people. Meanwhile, what's happening in Spain and Portugal, called the Iberian Peninsula, because there really was not a Spain or Portugal yet. The Muslims invaded way back in the 700s, even before Charlemagne, so a long time ago. The Muslims have been here forever. By the late 1300s, a group of northern Spanish kingdoms pushed them back, and you can see how Spain is not one country. It's Leon and Castile and Navarre and Aragon, and they fight back and start claiming more and more and more land. In fact, the country of Castile is named that because it has so many castles on the border between Castile and the Moorish states. That's what they're called. M-O-O-R, Moor means African Muslims. They eventually do form something kind of like a parliament called the Cortes, which is just a council of noblemen, people helping the king make decisions. And Ferdinand and Isabella are starstruck lovers. They are prince and princess of two warring families. Just because you're both Spanish doesn't mean you like each other. And I believe they're from Castile and Aragon, and they met at some kind of peace banquet that their parents threw to try to stop the fighting between them. And afterwards, they both go to their parents and say, "Hey, I met this cute other person. Met a cute princess." They're like, "No, you can't possibly go out with her. She's from Aragon, whatever." So they snuck out of their castles that night to see each other. And eventually, when they became king and queen of their respective countries, they decided, hey, my parents aren't around. We're allowed to get married now, and let's unite the kingdoms. And they united northern France and started what's called the Reconquista, which means the reconquering of all of Spain from the Muslims. And with those two countries united, they were able to push all the Muslims out of Spain in the year 1492. Very famous year there, right? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But Columbus only sailed the ocean blue because in 1492, this huge, decades-long war ended, and now Ferdinand and Isabella have the time and money and energy to do other things besides fight the Muslims. So, we just fought this huge war. We don't have to pay for that anymore. We just stole a lot of money from the Muslims from sacking their cities. So sure, have some money to go on a harebrained scheme to go around the world. They immediately wanted to make sure that, especially in their newly conquered areas, the Catholic Spaniards were supreme and anyone else was downtrodden. So there wasn't really a lot of Protestantism just yet. That was basically not a thing at all in Spain. There were a lot of Muslims there, and there were a lot of Jews there as well. And in fact, probably the famous medieval Jew of all time by the name of Moshe ben Maimonides. This guy, Maimonides, wrote literally the book about Judaism. Very famous guy that I've referenced in a lot of my papers, my theological papers. Anyway, he lived in Spain, in Aragon. So the Ferdinand and Isabella were devoutly Catholic, and they started the Spanish Inquisition to burn at the stake or torture to death anyone who was not firmly Catholic. Tens of thousands of Jews and Muslims got kicked out of the country. And at first, the Inquisition said either become Catholic or leave, and so thousands of people left. Eventually, they did say, if we suspect that you're not Catholic, we're going to murder you and steal all your land as well. So that made Ferdinand and Isabella very rich from stealing all these heretics' lands. And a bunch of Jews ran away to England, and they brought with them their favorite style of food, and that is food fried in olive oil. Olive oil, very common in Mediterranean places like Spain, not so much in places like England. And a dish that they brought to England was fish and chips, breaded, fried fish, and then later on potato chips, which means French fries as well. So the classic English dish, fish and chips, is actually Spanish Jewish origin. Pretty cool. What's happening in Germany and Italy, they do not go the same route as England, France, and Spain. They are not united. In fact, Germany is only united in the late 1800s. Well, same thing with Italy. They only get united in the late 1800s. Like around the time of our Civil War is when Germany and Italy become nations for the first time. They are dozens and dozens of different nations, all fighting each other as much as anyone else. The Hohenstaufens were a family that had control of a lot of northern Germany, but then they also owned like Sicily and southern Italy. Remember, they were descended from the Carolingians. I don't remember if we talked about them a whole lot, but they decided to stop meddling in Italy and just focus on Germany. In Italy is lots and lots of different nations. Some of the biggest ones were the Papal States, owned by the Pope. That's this cream color right here, Stato Pontificio, the Papal States. The Kingdom of Naples, Regno di Napoli, is this yellow one down here. Sicily, very strong. Venice, a very strong trading culture. We have Milan, Savoy, and Genova, also really important nations here. It is actually this nation right here that does conquer the rest of Italy in the 1850s. In Germany, they passed this law called the Golden Bull. A bull is like a church law, kind of. And that established what was called the Diet of the Holy Roman Empire. The Diet was a group of noblemen, so think parliament or something, but just noblemen allowed. And the top several noblemen of the country were called electors, and they would elect a king. I believe there were 6 electors at one time, although I do believe the number fluctuated from time to time. So now Germany is kind of like an empire, but it's also, one king, lots of very independent-minded noblemen. So you could easily say it's lots of different countries, not really one country. But they did have a very strong relationship with the Pope, and so called himself the Holy Roman Empire. And as it was said by famous historians through the year, the Holy Roman Empire was not holy, it was definitely not Roman, and it wasn't really an empire. It was just Germany, but lots of different sub-German states. So you can think of the Diet like parliament with lots of different electors. You have the elector of Saxony and Brandenburg. That's where the Brandenburg concertos were first written. Very beautiful. You have the Palatinates here. A bunch of those people came to America, and Ben Franklin did not like the Palatinates people. You have Bavaria. That's where Bavarian cream comes from Boston cream pies. And that's where Bavarian Motor Works comes from, B&W. Got Austria. Munster, that's where the cheese comes from. 7 electors, sorry, I said 6. 7 electors at first. Oh, Hesse is right here. That's where the Hessians come from in the American Revolution. Brunswick, that's where Brunswick comes from. It's cool. This is Holstein up here. That's where Holstein Friesian cows come from. The Habsburg family becomes an important royal family in the south of Germany, which renames itself Austria eventually. And the Austrian Empire once owned like half of Europe. The Habsburg family grows bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger through fighting and marriage until they become the most powerful family in the world. It gets really crazy powerful. And actually wars are fought to try to prevent this one family from becoming too powerful. Maximilian I was kind of like the founder of the Austrian Habsburg dynasty. He married a wife from the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Belgium, and gained a lot of territory up there. Then he married his second wife, who was from Milan, so he got a lot of holdings in Italy. And then his son married the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, so then they gained all of Spain as well. So for a time, they owned a big chunk of Central Europe, south of Germany and all that. And then all the Low Countries, and then all of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula as well. So Habsburgs everywhere, very, very, very powerful. And it's not until World War I that the Austrian Empire is defeated. So what year was Maximilian first rising to throne? Uh, he reigned 1493 to 1519. So if he died in 1519, that's like 400 years before 1918, World War I. So for about 400 years, the Austrian Empire was maybe not the most powerful nation in Europe, but definitely in the top 3 or 4 most powerful nations in Europe for 400 years. So very powerful family there.